This is Shop Talk with Writers.
Welcome to Shop Talk with Writers, the podcast where we talk to authors about the stories behind their books. I'm Elena Lappin, and my very special guest today is novelist Benjamin Markovits, whose latest novel, The Rest of Our Lives, is currently on the shortlist for this year's Booker Prize. As you will hear, we recorded this interview while the novel was still on the long list, and we booked it long before we knew that it would be selected. I simply loved this book, and I honestly can't imagine a reader who wouldn't be deeply affected by it. It is the story of Tom, a middle-aged husband and father who had decided years ago to leave his wife when their youngest child left home for university. As he now drives her there and continues his road trip alone, visiting people and places along the way, Tom has plenty of time to think about his life, his marriage, and his own role in his wife's unhappiness. Ben Markovits writes about seemingly ordinary lives with extraordinary sensitivity and a beautiful simplicity of perfectly balanced prose. You don't even notice how his writing manages to cut through your emotional defenses and go straight to your heart, like a blues song. Ben Markovits grew up in Texas, London, and Berlin. He is the author of 12 novels and is also an accomplished professional-level basketball player. He teaches creative writing at Royal Holloway, University of London. Enjoy.
My name is Ben Markovits. I'm an author, including of the novel The Rest of Our Lives, and I'm going to read the opening right now. You can hear the pages turning. When our son was 12 years old, my wife had an affair with a guy called Zach Zersky, whom she knew from synagogue. He was a little younger, 3 or 4 years, had 3 boys, all younger than our 2 kids, but was in some sense in the same position as my wife. They both had partners who made good money, which meant they didn't have to do much and got bored and restless and maybe even depressed. Zach's wife was head of oncology at Westchester County. I saw Zach touch Amy's hand under the fold-out table of the Purim food bank drive under the paper cloth. He was short, about 5'8", broad-shouldered and dark. He wore linen shirts open at the chest. His chest hair had started going gray. On Sundays, he played guitar for the kids at Temple Beth and taught them Jewish songs like Spin, Spin, C'est Vivant, very pro-Israel in a tree-planting, happy, clappy way. He was the kind of guy who danced with all the old ladies and little pigtailed girls at a bar mitzvah so he could also put his arm around the pretty mothers and nobody would complain. Even before I saw them holding hands, I didn't like him. My parents are Catholic, but my dad thought religion was just a big fancy dress party and he hated fancy dress. Maybe this is why I never got involved in the synagogue, which meant Amy had a whole social network where she had an identity and I didn't. She told me about Zach after I already knew and after it was already over. Amy had highly developed guilt feelings, which were so strong she couldn't help being mad at whoever she felt guilty toward, which was often me. She said she wanted to make me mad too. She just wanted some kind of reaction. That's all she was looking for, but that's not really my style. If there's something you can do to fix something, I try to do it, but in this case, I wasn't sure what. She said, "You don't feel anything about anything." I said, "Everything I do for you and the kids. Nothing else matters to me." "So what do you want to do?" I asked her. "Do you want a divorce?" But she didn't want that, at least not until the kids had left home. The home and the kids were all she had to show for the last 12 years of her life. The thing with Zach didn't mean anything. It was more like a kind of self-harm. She knew that I knew that when she was a teenager, she used to cut herself on the thigh, a bid for attention. But Amy's a person who tells stories about her motives and actions, which are very persuasive to her as well. So it's sometimes hard to talk about or even work out what's really going on. You fall in love with somebody when you're 26, and you see them in all kinds of different lights and according to their potential. But after years and years of marriage and shared parenting and all the other shared decisions you have to make just to get through the days, you accumulate a lot of data about that person that after a while just seems more or less accurate. If you continue to have illusions, that's your fault. So if you stay married, it's because you've accepted that this is what they're like and what your life with them is like, and you stop expecting them to do or give you things you know perfectly well they're unlikely to do or give you. It's like being a Knicks fan. But I also made a deal with myself. When Miriam goes to college, you can leave too. Maybe this was just another one of those illusions, but it helped me get through the first few months after Amy told me about Zach, and for the sake of the kids, we had to pretend that everything was fine. When in fact, what we obviously had, even when things smoothed over, was a C- marriage, which makes it pretty hard to score much higher than a B overall on the rest of your life.
Thank you so much. Ben Markovits, thank you for meeting us here at your publisher's home office.
Very grand and shiny new
Faber
office, yes.
And Faber in Hatton Garden. Can I mention that at this point in time, when we're doing this interview, you are longlisted for the Booker Prize.
Yes.
And I have to ask you, how does that feel?
It feels, I mean, I'm very happy about it. You know, it's, you know this, but you need bits of luck in your career just to keep going. And this is a nice bit of luck.
Does it make you feel expectant, or are you more sort of a pessimistic type, do you think? If it happens,
about what happens next?
Yeah.
No, I'm more of a, I mean, I used to play a lot of basketball. I'm more of a competitive type. So I would rather win than not win. But to be honest, I'm mostly just grateful for the attention it's gotten me so far.
Well, you've written so many books. I don't know exactly.
You say that almost like a reproach.
How many?
What's the right number of books to have written?
I mean, your books are, each one is so different. I brought a few with me today, and you picked one as your favorite. And the one you picked is called Christmas in Austin. Yeah. Austin being in Texas. Is that related to where you grew up?
Yes. So the family background in the novel is very similar to my family background. I am the child of a Jew from New York, and my mother is a German Christian. And we grew up in Texas because my parents are academics and they got jobs there. But it meant that we grew up on a kind of island, since both of my parents, for different reasons, were slightly detached from their own family backgrounds, and our own immediate family became this very important focus of our lives.
And did basketball come into your life simply because you are very tall and had the talent, or is that something you really passionately fell in love with? No,
I really love it. I really love it. I mean, in some ways, so when I was, I'm not sure how old I was, but at one point my dad built a hoop in our garden, our backyard. And it meant that when I came home from school, instead of playing on my phone as I would if I were a child of this generation, I would go out into the yard, because it was Texas, it was hot all the time, and shoot hoops. And actually shooting hoops is very similar to writing. It's something you can do on your own, and you just go over and over the same thing until it feels right. And if it feels right when you write a sentence, you're never quite sure, but if it feels right when you're playing basketball, the net makes this beautiful swish, and you know that the universe said yes, and it's a very satisfying way to spend an afternoon.
This brings back memories of my own, because some of this novel, the one we're here to talk about, which is called The Rest of Our Lives, it begins and takes place, much of it, in Westchester, and there are loops being shot all over the place. And I actually lived there. I didn't live in Scarsdale, but I lived in Pleasantville. I lived in Valhalla. I know exactly this milieu that you're describing, and I found it deadly.
You didn't like it there?
It's incredibly beautiful, and it's really deadly. It's a kind of emotional desert, and everyone's depressed. And I think the kids we took our kids away from there to London.
To get away.
To a much lower sort of standard of living,
Yeah.
if you can believe that. But a much happier one, just an instant sort of connection with your environment, with people around you. But I found Westchester a dangerous place emotionally.
Did the kids hate it too?
They would have to be asked directly. No, I don't think they hated it, but they fell in love with London very quickly.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way. But we had that hoop.
Yeah, you had the hoop in the yard.
We had the hoop.
Yeah.
Then we put one up in London as well, because that had to be copied,
Yes,
of course.
yes.
So I have two boys who were into basketball, particularly my older one, and the friends were over there daily,
Yes, yes,
shooting hoops,
yes.
shooting hoops, shooting. So I know exactly what you're talking about. But it didn't seem solitary to me. It seemed like something that they like to do together and competitively.
Yeah, it's both. I mean, so my favorite Friday night, I've never managed to reproduce it in adulthood, is when my buddies would come around after school and we'd shoot hoops in the yard and then maybe get some pizza and watch a game. And there's nothing I'd rather do on a Friday night.
That was great. That was great.
Even at the age of 51, it's the thing I would most like to do. But you can do it on your own. That's the beauty of basketball. You can really practice satisfyingly on your own.
So if you're competitive while playing on your own,
Yeah.
how does that actually translate into being competitive in other domains? Or competitive against yourself?
That's interesting. So the truth is, to succeed, this is a roundabout way of answering your question, to succeed on a basketball team in high school and older as well, you have to be able to navigate a locker room full of boys. And I couldn't do it. I didn't know how to assert myself in that company. I got better at it as I got older, but it meant that every time I tried to take the things I had practiced on my own into the world, I failed miserably. My dad would come along to games on a Friday night because I played on the high school basketball team, and he'd basically watch me sitting on the bench while the game went on without me. And I wouldn't want to get in the game because I knew I'd have screwed up. But while this was going on, while I was stinking it up on the basketball court, in school, I was getting taller and I was actually getting much better. And so away from high school, I had turned into a pretty good basketball player. So when my buddies came around, I never lost. And I had this split identity where in the privacy of my imagination, as it were, I was enormously successful and actually quite good. And then as soon as I went out into the world, I sucked again. And that seemed like that's an interesting contrast to work with as a novelist. Mm-hmm. Because I think one of the things the novel is very good at is giving a social context to people's lives. But it is also very good at interiority and what people feel like in themselves, totally detached from their social context. And I had a vivid experience of that as a kid playing basketball.
So you lived in Texas till what age?
So we moved around a lot. I gather you've moved around a lot. My parents are academics. Texas gets very hot. They took sabbaticals. So I was in Texas basically from 2 until I graduated high school. But in between, we lived in London for several years. We lived in Oxford and we lived in Berlin.
So they describe you everywhere as a British American German novelist. What is the description that you feel most comfortable with yourself, if any?
I don't know. When I was a kid in Germany, somebody once said to me, halb Ami, halb Mensch, which means half American, half human. And when I was a kid in England, someone once said to me, you're kind of half English, half American, and half German. It was like primary school. They weren't very good at math. My books are mostly set in America. They mostly have American voices. On the other hand, by this point, I've lived in London longer than I've lived anywhere else. So I guess British American.
So in that, we're very similar. That's what happened to me too.
Where are you most at home? London?
I don't want to go into that,
Okay.
because that would become a completely different conversation and probably a boring one for people who want to hear about you. But I've lived in lots of countries and different languages, and at least you've just had mostly one language.
Yeah, so the reason I find it interesting is because we moved around a lot, but
Yeah.
I always would have said that home was Austin, Texas when I was a kid. That was the one
Yes.
stable thing in my life.
Huh.
And I have cousins who grew up in Italy, French mother, German father, and they speak 4 languages almost equally well, but actually aren't quite at home in any of them. And that seemed to me a really interesting state to be in, because I always knew what the home was. The home was Austin.
Till now.
Till now, yeah. That is true.
Well, I'd love to talk about that, because that's very much part of the novel in all sorts of interesting ways. But I wanted to ask you about something that intrigues me in your biography, which is this switch from being in basketball, being a basketball player, I don't know to what level professionally, and then you fall for the romantic poets, in particular Byron, academically as well as in terms of writing fiction. Where is that link between the two?
I mean, the truth is, as I said before, I was never a very good basketball player. I did play professionally in Germany after university, but it was partly because I thought I'd be able to write about it. And it was also just seemed like a fun thing to do. I never took it seriously as a career. I always wanted to be a writer, more or less, since I was 10 years old. I wanted to be a poet at first, and then after university, I decided on fiction. But the basketball was not a real career option. It was just something I liked doing. Does that answer the question?
Well, so then when you dropped basketball or left it, then it was a very natural move.
So I mean, this is not very interesting, but so when I quit basketball, I moved in with a high school friend of mine who was living in Oxford at the time. And I scooped ice cream and worked on my first novel, which became The Sign Papers. But after about 4 months of that, I was getting a little bored. And so I signed up to the local university, which was Oxford University, and studied the Romantics.
So what I'm really fascinated by is you wrote a series of novels related to Byron, from his environment, other characters around him. And I'd love to know what in particular fascinated you about his lifestyle and his work.
I started reading Byron when I was a teenager. For my bar mitzvah, I was given a copy of Edith Sitwell's North Atlantic Anthology of English and American Verse. Do you know this book? It's a really wonderful book. It's completely mad, but it's a wonderful collection. And she wrote these prefaces to the poets she really admired. She didn't really admire Byron. She didn't write a preface for him. But I think that anthology had the beginning of English Bards and Scotch Reviewers by Byron. And it's funny. And part of what drew me is I was suspicious of poetry that pretended people were sadder than they were in order to achieve a poetic state. And I was suspicious of poetry that used a language that was unlike the ordinary language we would use. And part of what's great about Byron, which I guess I had sensed even as a kid, was that he uses a very ordinary language. And his poems are sometimes sad, but they're also funny and lighthearted, especially later in his career. And so that was part of the attraction of Byron, his use of the vernacular, but also his willingness to mix the tragic and the comic.
So in this Byron novel, one called A Quiet Adjustment, you're actually focusing on one of the women in his life.
Yeah.
And I found that very connected to what I find in the rest of your books. You have an amazing ability to understand a multitude of characters very deeply from within, and to tell their stories deeply from within their own voices and their lives. So you're never, even the rest of our lives, this current novel, which is the story of one man, but there are so many other people in his life who you, just by showing us how he understood and observed them, even though he thinks or presents himself as someone who doesn't really understand emotions. But he actually does. He has a way, he has a method of understanding and explaining how people feel and how they function, which is incredibly deep, but at the same time, with a very light touch. So what you call ordinary language, you use that to an amazing effect. I was lost in that book very, very quickly. In fact, the reading that you gave us, I read about half of it immediately after reading it myself. I read it to my husband. And he thought it sounded so real. He said, "Is this autobiographical? Did this just happen to this guy?" I said, "I don't know. It's a novel." But it has that effect on people. On your readers, it feels incredibly natural, which is very misleading because it is actually, as it progresses, very, very complex. So this novel is described as a road trip, father and daughter driving her to college. It's a long drive, 7 hours. And I thought, for some reason, that was the framework of the novel, when in fact it is not at all. What happens is he does drive her, but then he drops her off and the road trip continues, but it's just him. And what I find really, really beautiful and very impressive about this novel, and so if you win the Booker Prize, you will have certainly earned it, is the fact that it moves forward, because he's constantly moving forward. He's driving from one place to another, but actually each part of that journey is a step back into what his life has been, in order to understand it, in order to understand where he's been and where he is going. He has decisions to make, as you just read in the very first few lines. His decision to make is, do I or do I not, at this point, leave my wife because of that very old case of adultery? But it's not so simple. And we don't know until the very end what will happen. And it becomes almost irrelevant. What becomes much more relevant is not will he or won't he, but to understand this man and who he is and this family. And this, I think, and I think you do this in all the novels where you write about families. Each family member has their own story, which both connects with the others and really does not. Each one is an individual. So I'd love to talk to you about your main protagonist, Tom. Mm-hmm. Do you really think yourself, did you want him to come across as someone who has trouble with emotions?
That's a good question. I mean, when I'm writing, I both try to think about what I'm writing all the time, and I also try not to think about it too much. And with this book, what actually happened is, I don't know what I was doing. I was maybe sitting reading something and had an idea of the opening sentence. And I got up, sat down at my computer, and wrote more or less the section I just read to you very quickly. I don't know if it was all of it, but it was a version of that. And I was working on another novel at the time and forgot about it for months. And once I'd finished that novel, I came back to it. And I think there were a couple of things that interested me about that thing I just wrote down out of the blue. One was that it was a story of a man who felt like he had some sexual injustice done to him, rather than the woman. So that he was both threatened, I guess, in his masculinity a little bit, but also felt like he hadn't done anything wrong. So it was a story about a guy who felt like he hadn't done anything wrong. And that was interesting to me. But the other part that was interesting was that bit at the end where he talks about if you have a C- marriage, you can't score much higher than a B on the rest of your life. And what interested me about that was, like, on some level, that seems reasonable, seems true. on another level, it seems like obviously the wrong way to think about these things. And that combination of a way of looking at your life that can be both reasonable and completely wrong seemed a good starting point for a novel about him.
He is a very good father, but the reason why he's a good father is very interesting. He's not the kind of father who's overbearingly caring, but he is the kind of father who steps in where his wife, as a mother, is actually extremely deficient because of her neuroses and because of her issues which prevent her from being too judgmental. He is very calm. He's a calm presence. He's also a stable presence. And that's a very interesting question. Is he really stable? Because as he moves forward in the story, one wonders, how stable is he really? And the other question I have about Tom is, you seem to want to present him as someone who doesn't think that women like him. But actually, he scores every time he meets a woman throughout the entire novel. Every time there's a woman in a bar or on the street or anywhere, in a motel, absolutely anywhere, yes, or old girlfriends, he scores. So what's up with that?
Who should play him in the movie?
Not George Clooney.
Not George Clooney, no. I don't know, which one am I answering? The stable presence one. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the premise of the book is that he does something quite unstable. He drives off. He doesn't go home. He doesn't deal with what he should be dealing with.
But he drives off without planning on it, because he doesn't take anything with him.
He takes nothing with him. Yeah, that was important to me. I didn't want to... Sometimes when I describe the book, I say it's about a guy whose wife had an affair when the kids were little. He makes a deal with himself that he will stick out the marriage until the youngest leaves home. And then he remembers the deal when he drops her off at university. And that makes it seem much more calculated than I wanted him to seem. So it was very important to me that in the event, in the moment, what happens is not that he's acting on some deal that he's made with himself 12 years ago, but that he suddenly sees an opening. And he takes it. So one of the jokes of the book is that his daughter refers to him as angry white male, partly when he starts to provoke silly arguments. But part of the joke is that he's the least angry person in the room. And I think it's right that Amy, his wife, is deficient in some respects as a mother, but she's also doing something that he refuses to do, which is to get her hands dirty with the mess of family life. He just wants everything to be fine. And that's one of the things she reproaches him with. And I think that is a failure on his part, just to be pals with his daughter, just to be pals with his kids. And he does say at one point that quite often Amy, even though she's getting many things wrong in her interactions with the kids, is sometimes a little bit more intuitive about what they're really going through than he is, because he's just their good time dad. And I was interested by that too. I didn't, it was important to me in the beginning of the book to present Amy in such a way that it would make sense, both that Miri wouldn't want her coming along to drop her off, and that Tom would walk out on her. But I also wanted it essentially to be a loving book in which what happens as the story goes on is a kind of reconciliation. And that meant that there had to be something there to reconcile yourself with. And so that was the challenge that I kind of set myself in the opening scenes.
There's also kind of literary retribution where it kind of reminds me, years ago, I read a story of mine which is about adultery to a little book club. Mm-hmm. And the only question that I got from this book club audience was, do you believe in retribution? And I said, why is that relevant? That's not what the story is about. But this man kept repeating that question. Mm-hmm. Do you believe in retribution? In your novel,
what did he mean by that?
Well, that's what I asked him.
Yeah.
What would that mean?
Yeah.
But in your novel, there's a beautiful act of literary retribution, which is that after everything has happened and years later, Zach Zursky, the culprit of this affair, turns out to be an absolute loser. Yeah. And that's lovely. Yeah. I enjoyed that very much. because it kind of left everyone in the clear, and it was retribution without actual retribution. That was fun, and it was funny as well. But I love how this whole journey is a major kind of demonstration of Americana. And I was wondering, did you actually take this trip yourself? Did you drive to these places?
So I've done a number of road trips across America. Have you done road trips across the States?
Not enough.
Not enough. I love it. Actually, part of this road trip was based on a journey I took with my wife and 2 kids the summer before I wrote the book. And we touched on some of the same places, not all of them, and obviously the experiences were different. But the other part of the book, which I haven't mentioned yet, is that Tom is sick with something that hasn't been diagnosed. And I was sick with what Tom had, and it hadn't been diagnosed. I kept going to the doctors, and they couldn't find out what was wrong. And while I was taking this family road trip, I was getting sicker and sicker. And so some of what happens in the book did happen to me. In the book, various people have to deal with the fallout from it. In reality, it was my wife who had to deal with all of it. But it gave that summer holiday of ours a kind of intensity, which made it, I think, for all of us, one of the most important but also fun holidays we ever went on. It was really great. Probably because the country...
Did it include visiting people, staying with people?
There was a little bit of that. We didn't visit an ex-girlfriend, which is what Tom does in the book. But yes, so you see people that you've had close friendships with in the past that you're no longer really in touch with. That's part of the road trip. But there's something about the scale of the country and the landscape that makes you reevaluate your life. Because when you go on any kind of holiday, I think one of the questions most people ask themselves is, could I start again here? Could I start again here? And especially as an American who spent most of his adult life living in England, it's a very poignant question for me and for my kids to some extent. Could we start again here?
Well, your protagonist has a history of a basic trauma because his father left the family and did in fact start a whole new life with someone else in a different place, different family, different woman, different children, which no longer had anything to do with him and his brother and his mother. And that was a starting over in a very painful way for his sons. And that is in part something very big that he's dealing with. And when he ultimately visits his grave, there's a lot of meaning to that. Part of the road trip is a kind of emotional homecoming, even though as he's driving for, is it a week or more, it just seems aimless, but it isn't aimless because he always has a place to go to, someone to visit, someone to see, a particular location to get to. But as he moves from place to place and observes almost like a film camera, the environment, the roads and the landscapes and the cities, I love that. It's like watching a road movie filmed by someone with an incredible eye for how people live. I remember driving around, not road trips in the States, but sort of in the direction of. And every time we drove into places I'd never seen before, I used to say this pretty stupid sentence, but it became my traditional question in the car. So people actually live here and they send their kids to college. Who are they? I will never know them. Who lives here? And that's the sense you get that this man, your protagonist, feels very much on the outside of everything he observes and visits and sees, but at the same time he realizes there is the potential of actually getting in there. And if I decide to stay here, if this stranger who has just invited me to her birthday party because clearly she liked me, I could do that. Or, I could get back together with my ex and stay here. So all these possibilities are there. And I was wondering for you, as he's moving from place to place and having these thoughts, did you want to show, or do we all have so many possibilities in life so that by middle age, we have a wealth of them that we've discarded?
Yeah.
And do we still want to go back and do that again, do any of that again? Or does there come a point where we can say, well, what I've done, that's been my choice, and it's fine?
I mean, I think one of the problems with middle age is that people still want to live as if the shape of their lives is up for grabs. And that can, the options narrow as you get older. When you're young, you just take it for granted. Everything is still in play. And I think people struggle with the idea that they've more or less set on the course that they've gone for the past 30 years. So I think that is a big part of the story. I think the heart, for me, of Tom's predicament is this sense he has. He doesn't begin the novel with it, but as the story goes on, he comes to realize it more and more, that you can do almost anything to yourself. And it might not even make you unhappy, that you can experiment on yourself and your life in almost any way, and maybe you'll even be happier than you were before. But there's something terrifying about your own capacity to betray the life you'd had before. And that's what his dad did. His dad did this thing to his life. He blew up his old family and he started another one. And Tom is forced to reckon with what that decision must have looked like, because he's on the verge of it himself.
And in Tom's own life, there were so many different paths that he decided to take, from sports to writing to law.
Yeah.
All these possibilities that he did explore, did think about, dared, didn't dare, chose for some reason, didn't choose. And I think you do that so beautifully. You make, any reader reading this can automatically relate that to their own choices in life, and a kind of a slow, very relaxed thinking about how have I become who I am right now at this point in my life, and where do I go from here? It's a very chill way of doing it. It's not existential angst, or, there's nothing sort of philosophical about it. You can superimpose that if you like, but the actual basis of it is very relaxed, and I love that. Mm-hmm. And another aspect is, which I found really fascinating, but also I think really important, is how you present these men. So you mentioned that his daughter Miriam accuses him of being an angry white male, but there are so many men in his circle of friends or former friends or colleagues who fall into the category of middle-aged men who are completely now on the outside of what's happening.
Or feel that they're on the outside.
Yes. And actually, not just passively so, but they actually refuse to go along with what's happening in academia, in politics, in social circles, in sports circles. And it made me kind of sad for a whole generation of men who really don't know where they belong and how to think and how to be, because what they thought was right suddenly isn't right.
Yeah.
Even in basic sort of interactions with their own children.
Yeah.
Is that something you've come across?
Yeah, well, I figured if a middle-aged guy goes on a road trip or he visits old buddies, this will come up, this sense that the culture has passed them by.
But it came up even in his own life,
at
his own university.
Life too, yes.
So he teaches freedom of speech.
Yes, he teaches a class on it.
And things come up which are said in relation to that topic, and then complaints are made. And I think he kind of loses his sense of what is allowed and what isn't allowed.
Yeah.
And there he doesn't come across as weak, by the way. He comes across as someone who does take a stand or wants to.
Yeah. Though ultimately the stand ends up with his interview with a disgruntled basketball player who is so far beyond the pale that it makes Tom think, is this really the road that I want to go down? That sense that people have that the culture has passed them by. I don't think it's limited to men. I think anybody as you get older feels like, the culture that you grew up with, that for all its flaws you felt at home in, is no longer the one that's pertains to your kids' lives, to the next generation. And what are you supposed to do with that feeling? And I think to some extent Tom's view is you're supposed to let it go. But there's a danger if you become the person who lets everything go. And I think that was another one of the little intentions or internal contradictions that I wanted to write about in the novel.
There is a sentence. So you've written a novel called A Quiet Adjustment, the one about Byron, or one of the novels about Byron called A Quiet Adjustment. And in this novel, you use that phrase twice.
Do I? I didn't know that.
In the beginning, in the part that you've read, I think. But you do mention that he's thinking about changes. And there's a slight adjustment that he refers to. And I found, because you mentioned it twice, and because you called a whole novel A Quiet Adjustment, there's something about your way of thinking, of your way of kind of observing life and reality, that is all about tiny adjustments, small changes, not huge changes, not revolutionary changes, but like gentle ones. Is that
Yes, that's what
true?
Interests me. Yeah.
And that's what you observe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm part of a large family. I have 4 siblings, and you try to stake your claim as a member of a big family to territory that is very like the territory next to you, because your siblings are very much like you, but you still have to somehow differentiate yourself.
Yeah.
So I think large family life is about slight differentiations. The phrase "a quiet adjustment," it's been a while since I wrote that book, but I didn't come up with it. I can't remember if his wife came up with it or the lawyers involved in their separation. It was a phrase for the kind of separation they were going to have, just a quiet adjustment. Of course, it became the loudest, I don't know, you can't call it a divorce, but the loudest separation in, I mean, not in literary history, but one of the more spectacular breakups.
So he's a kind of unlikely hero, actually.
Yeah.
He is a hero in the sense that he actually does make a huge effort to think things through and to experience things that he's not comfortable with.
Were you talking about Tom or Byron here?
Tom,
yeah.
Yes. Byron, I don't think, had any trouble with slight adjustments at all. Everything was big and strongly expressed and openly so. No?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's hard to measure this stuff, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
he made grand gestures, but the grand gestures didn't always succeed.
But Tom
Yes.
is, I mean, he would be my personal hero. If I knew him, he'd be the guy. Maybe that's why women are drawn to him, because they feel that he listens and is actually interested and also makes really sensible decisions. So whenever he's almost seduced into something, he actually switches his thinking on and decides to do the right thing and steps away. That's very interesting because that's not entirely common. So he's kind of a good guy.
I think he's a good guy, though. I think it's also one of his problems in the book that if you spend some part of your life, especially inside a marriage, thinking I haven't done anything wrong, you're going to make it hard for your partner if you're the guy who never does anything wrong.
Well, that's a very interesting aspect of the affair.
Yeah.
Because she's the one who had the affair, but the entire time, whenever you write about what she said to him about it, what he thought about it himself, there's a sense that she felt that he was implicated, that he was part of the affair, that she had the affair because of how things were with him. And that's where he feels actually somewhat responsible, not completely outside of it. But he's not, as you said in the very beginning, it's not my style to, make a big scene or run away. But he is engaged with her. Also, what's really interesting is that as the road trip progresses and he's thinking a lot to himself, he's reflecting, a lot of these inner conversations are actually between him and Amy.
Yes.
Increasingly so. And that's where you gently lead the reader towards an understanding of a slight adjustment at this stage in their marriage, which is just beautifully done.
Thank you.
And another note that I made, couple of things you said about him, which were just really stunningly spot on. He feels on the outside of things, and he also sometimes feels like a fraud. He feels like, I come across as this and that, but I'm not really that guy. That's a very strong side of his personality, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, to get a couple of points. I mean, I think one of the terrifying things about a marriage or any long-term relationship is that you have such a big hand in what your partner becomes, and they have a big hand in what you end up being like. And you watch that happening, and sometimes you can, through what seems like no fault of your own, have created an environment in which your partner is forced to change in ways that you don't like. And he's watching that happen, and he does feel like he's implicated in it. So even though he felt very upset by the affair, it's not that he's angry all the time toward her. He sees that she's in a tough spot, that her life hasn't turned out the way that she wanted it to, and that he is maybe himself partly guilty. And I don't know if you do this, but I quite often have my most fruitful conversations with people when I'm not in their presence, especially if you're on your own, staying in motel rooms, no normal human interactions. You talk to people in your head.
I always feel I'm having a conversation with the author of a novel I'm reading, and if I'm enjoying it, I feel like I'm talking to him.
Yes.
Which is the main reason why I started this podcast, because to finish a book, love it, and then be able to actually talk to the author almost immediately is an incredible gift. So that's why we're here.
I hope I'm not too much less interesting in life than Tom is on the page.
No. So, speaking of reading and writing, there's a lot about that, considering that he is a lawyer. He is, he's an academic, but, half of his heart is in sports and basketball. But there's a lot about writing, and there's a lot about wanting to write. And he at some point decides to write a book. He plays with the idea of writing a book about, what does he call it?
Pick up basketball,
which means basically going anywhere and playing with whoever happens to be there. And that is something that my son does. Both my sons, they do that. They do that in London. They do that in the state. Wherever they go, they do that. And you meet people.
Yes, it's a wonderful culture.
So the idea of writing a book about it is actually a brilliant one. I hope you will do that.
Yeah.
Have you considered actually writing that book?
I would love to. I'm maybe too old for it now. I'm not sure my game is where it needs to be. I'd like to be a bit better than I am now.
Yeah, but the conversation,
would be the same.
It's because what actually happens there, the kind of interaction that happens there, is it competitive or is it more about connecting with people?
It's both. I mean, I think competition is about connecting with people. When you compete with somebody, if you compete against somebody, you really have to think hard about what they're good at and what they're like. And so it's a form of conversation. And one of the advantages it has as a form of conversation is that often when you talk to people, you end up realizing at some point that you're not really talking about the same thing. But the point of sports is to make sure that you're talking about the same thing. And so when Tom plays basketball, like with his old college buddy, he sees how good he is at manipulating the world around him. And it's a real form of intimacy. He could write that book about pickup basketball. But I think part of what I like about him is that he's sort of half-hearted about it. he knows he's not going to follow through on it. He was.
But it becomes something to talk about.
It becomes something to talk about rather than talking about what's really going on.
Exactly. It becomes something that he can actually bring up and have a conversation about, even with people who he has nothing else to talk to about.
Yes.
Something else, maybe.
Because he doesn't want to say to them, I've just walked out of my marriage.
Yes.
That's too intimate. But he can talk about this book. He has a vague plan of writing.
By the way that comes up without him wanting to, it just kind of comes up almost like an afterthought, or I had a dream, I dreamt this and that, and he just says, I think I may have left Amy.
Yes.
He's not sure, but he needs to say it and to see what happens when he says it. Oh, hard to stop describing the very, very, very many wonderful aspects of this novel. And
thank you.
Not only this novel on its own, but the way it connects with your other work. So I honestly don't know if there is a novelist writing today in this kind of British American sphere, I suppose you can connect them, about family life, about marriage from a male point of view, while understanding all sides. It is so contemporary, it's so genuinely of today, including the devastating effects of COVID on family lives, on health, on relationships, on trauma being kind of reincarnated through that pain. I think this is the first novel I've read that deals with COVID in this way. And I felt, when I read that, wow, finally, we're beginning to see that in literature. So I think you've done that very well as well.
You.
And Ben, can we ask, what are you working on now?
So I have, I've got to do the edits on a book, which I think Faber will bring out in the spring of 27. It's a story of a marriage and a woman who finds that she has slowly been sidelining her ambitions in favor of her successful husband's, even though the kind of terms of their attraction to each other was that she was the cleverer one. And I wanted to leave it unclear, even at the end of the book, whether on some level she's getting her way, because part of what happens to you, at least what happens to me, is you go deeper into family life, is that you stop caring about the stuff that isn't family life. Or whether, in fact, she's been beaten down by a process that she couldn't get the upper hand on. Anyway, so that's what I think it's going to be called Starting Out, but that's the working title.
And finally, we thought it would be cool to have one question that we ask of every writer we interview. And so far, I haven't really had that question, but I've just come up with it. So you're the first one.
Yes.
And that question is, why do you write?
It's changed over time. Has it changed for you? Yeah. I think when I was younger, I wanted to write poetry that aimed at something about the ordinary life around me. And that's also what I want to write about in my fiction. But I think increasingly as I get older, it becomes a kind of avenue for experiencing things when my life is really very narrow. I sit around, I write a bit, I hang out with the kids, I make some supper, we go to bed. And so that the writing becomes an outlet for the kind of appetite for experience I used to have when I was younger. Does that sound true to you?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Well, Ben Markovits, thank you so much for being on Shop Talk with Writers.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. You didn't know you were obsessed with minor adjustments.
No, one of the lines I sometimes say is that I like to make my case in the small claims court. Because that seems more interesting to me than the big cases. Yeah.
Which Judge Judy.
Yeah, Judge Judy, yes. I do not watch Judge Judy. Is Judge Judy worth watching?
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Genius.
I like writing. I like fiction in which real life seems to be on the page, but in which when people expose themselves on TV
But they don't expose themselves emotionally, you see, to her. When they try, she says, this is not the place. If you want to do that, go and be on Dr. Phil. This is literally about what... And the best part is when she asks them to describe, how they see something, and they start saying things like, I felt or I thought, and she said, I'm not interested in that, just tell me what you did. That is brilliant, because if you take away how you feel about things and only describe what actually happened step by step, you're left with reality of the starkest kind.
So what's hard is that when you do that with somebody you're close to, and you can't get at a shared mutual account of what happened.
Exactly, and nobody agrees.
Even on the facts. That's really different.
This was an episode of Shop Talk with Writers. Our guest today was British-American novelist Benjamin Markovits, whose novel, The Rest of Our Lives, has been selected for this year's Booker Prize shortlist. The Rest of Our Lives is published by Faber. Join us again soon for exciting episodes with writers Anne Morgan, Julian Borger, Arifa Akbar, Moira Buffini, and others. If you enjoyed this podcast, please let us know in your comments and share it with friends. Thank you very much for listening.